Hi guys, it's Verts here and welcome to 3D Mutiny. I'm going to go through our Discord users' feedback. Basically, we've got a Discord where users can create their work in progress forums. There's lots of really awesome characters that have been developing here. Every month I dive in and start to give some more formalized paint overs. So it's a really good opportunity to get some feedback from someone who's been in the industry and also is a games art educator at university. I also delve into the art feedback channel. So the art feedback channel is just a little bit of a faster way to get feedback. So if you haven't already, definitely dive into the Discord and join, introduce yourself and create a work in progress forum. Really good way to stay accountable and increase your skills to eventually become a industry character artist. The first bit of feedback is for this user who's doing an orc warrior, and orcs are really cool when you're practicing. Often they can be quite forgiving. So say for example, you don't have to be so accurate when it comes to facial anatomy. You can focus more on basically the style of the character. And also orcs are just really fun to do. Nice to see you've progressed in the channel and you've actually provided an update on your sculpts. Seems that you're starting to move into more of the detailed phase and potentially exiting your block out. That being said, I've got a bit of feedback for you. So especially before you go into your retopology phase, it's just going to bring it slightly closer to your 2D concept and just a couple of tips to make it slightly easier. So the first one I start is quite broad, is just looking at the 2D concept. And when I look at this character, what I see, especially a lot in the body area, he's not as X-framed, or he doesn't have such a bodybuilder frame. What I see in your character is this big triangle. That's indicative of bodybuilders. So say for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger, there's this very heroic effect, and especially when you're doing muscles, it's easier to fall into that. But don't forget the original style of your concept. So with this character, he's got quite a large trunk in comparison to the width of his shoulders. And it's more indicative of something like this, which is like a dad bod. So when I look at that, it's a mixture of a dad bod, but increased strength. So if you want to bring that style back into your sculpt, I basically suggest getting these areas, especially the sides of the shoulders, and just bringing them in slightly, maybe increasing the size of the trunk. Now it's most evident when you look at the pectoral area. He's got quite a squared pectoral. So if I draw squares here in comparison to yours, which are quite elongated, and as I said, you usually see that in the classic Arnold look of a body, and potentially with an orc you're not going for that look, you're looking for something that's a bit more brutal or like brutalized. So a good way to look at that is how the 2D artist has interpreted it. So if you look at this shape, it's quite a long elongated triangle shape all the way to his feet. Now if you're gonna take that shape and just overlay it on top of yours, you'll probably find that the shoulders are escaping that shape. So just bring these shoulders in. You can keep all the details that you've got. That's the nice effect with ZBrush. Obviously you can go down subdivisions, maybe just move a couple of these subtools inwards, but I think you'll really benefit from that more orcish, like a hunched over look. In combination with that, I basically look at the open space, everything that's above the belt. So if I was going to draw this up into the belt and then bring it all the way onto the shoulders, you can see this sort of like trapeze shape. In the 2D concept, either the belt is much lower, and obviously this is a longer rectangular shape. Now in your case, in terms of proportions, it might be the fact that this belt is getting a little bit too large, and you're finding it difficult to position it correctly. So if you look on the 2D concept, the belt, while it is bulky, it's actually not taking too much shape in terms of the overall concept. So maybe just make this a little bit thinner and less long. So bring it downwards. It seems that it's okay for the bottom half. I just think it's resting a little bit too high. So just bring that down. The easiest way to interpret that is basically imagine where the bottom of the rib cage is going to be. If I draw on the 2D concept, the bottom of the rib cage is roughly located here. Can sometimes be a useful method to draw underlying skeleton structure. Now, if I was going to imagine where the ribcage is on your sculpt, roughly around here, I can see by the abdominals and the serratus muscles. So as you can see, basically the difference here is that the belt is going over the rib cage, where on the 2D concept, the ribs are slightly above the belt. That's obviously going to help with motion. If you imagine that you've got this hard bit of structure above your rib cage, it's going to be hard to bend forward, it's going to be hard to bend backwards. So it can break a little bit of the realism and obviously go off from your 2D concept. So I think that would be a really beneficial change if you bring this downwards. And also in the case of thematics, if you just look at it from a distance, quite a large space is being taken up by the belt, and it hasn't necessarily got the most intricate or interesting details. All the interesting details are sort of like on the upper half of the body or around the face. Next area I would observe is the accessories, and it's just that these seem a little bit dainty in comparison to the beads that are on the 2D concept. So with that sort of like classic orcish look, I always remember that they have really large beads. So you might want to interpret that onto your 3D concept. When I look at the end of this sword, it might be that it's getting a little bit too large in terms of its radius. So on the concept, the weapon that he's holding is a little bit more squared off. And especially if we look at the underlying sword here, instead of it being spherical, it's actually quite flattened, right? Almost like a samurai sword. Now I think in comparison to his hand and the size it has here, I think he'd be very hard pressed to basically hold that. So you'd either just want to decrease the size of that sword so it's not taking up so much of the visual space, make it a little bit closer to the 2D concept, or potentially increase the accuracy of the hand. So while we're on the note of the hand, I think it would benefit from basically bringing in a bit more angular structure in here. So if you look on the 2D concept, we've got a lot of squared sections, almost like it's comprised out of squares, and the knuckles are definitely very big. On the concept here, they're a little bit more human-like, and I can't see the bony structures in the knuckles, so you might want to bring those out. Always a good idea as well, especially with those characters with the larger hand, is try and approach it with this angle and have those two sections really turn a corner. And that means you can just get something like a clay brush, go on the knuckles and then just build those out. That's going to give it a bit more of a brutal look. What also might be missing here as well, especially with an orc, it could be that the taper on the forearm right here is getting a little bit too thin for the kind of style of the character it is. So this section's very small. You might just want to get the wrist and bring it outwards so it looks a bit more realistic, like the hand could actually support that. If this is like an orc warrior, it looks like that his wrists would snap really easily. On the concept, these are a little bit more flattened. So what I can see here is quite an extreme taper from where his forearm muscles are all the way down to his wrist bone. Yet on the concept, you've obviously got this more elongated and less thick structure. So just an adaptation on the proportions that you've got, especially when it comes to width. I think you've got the height right, maybe just moving the accessories down, but definitely focus on the width of certain and the circumference of limbs. Moving on to the face, as it is now, I think that the eyes are getting slightly lost in the amount of features and noise that are here. So on the 2D concept, we've got very small horns that are coming out. Obviously, you've made the decision to increase the size of those, but in doing that, and especially with the size of his brows, I think from a distance, if we look on this section, his eyes are getting lost. The eyes are going to be really important when it comes to character design. You might want to increase the size of that. There's multiple ways of doing it. You don't necessarily have to increase the size of the actual physical eyeball. You can just open up the space around it, or you could have the features of sort of like a poly paint. I know this artist here, what they've done is they've darkened that area just to open up the eyes. But even that being said, you can see that the iris and the cornea area is actually quite presented, whereas here the eyeballs seem very small. So if you're going to draw an iris on there, you wouldn't have much space free to draw that. So it might be that you do have to increase the size of the eyeballs. I definitely suggest it. I think at this point, if you're making taking liberties as a 3D artist, I'd probably make the decision to increase the size Cyclops eye here. I think in the 2D concept, it's not so clear that it's presented. So if you're exactly matching that 1-to-1, I have a suspicion in the 3D that's going to get lost. So maybe just make that a little bit bigger. In terms of the mouth area, I think a lot of improvements could come here. So it's basically trying to interpret the underlying mandible structure and how that interacts with the teeth. Right now, obviously, the lower jaw has a lot of mass, but I think what's been interpreted here, that's been converted into a large lip. Character down here, it doesn't necessarily have large lip structure. It's just everything that is around it. So if we can observe the top lip, it almost seems to be quite flat with a non-existent top of lip. And that's basically happening because if I draw some teeth, obviously we've got an underbite of the tooth and then the top tooth is going behind that one. Now with normal people, their lips sort of like go like this and then they can rest on top of the tooth which is behind. That's going to give you your normal lip structure. Now obviously with an orc, or it happens with humans as well, if that tooth is far backwards or they have like a failing structure, basically the front lip's going to rotate inwards like this way. So if you draw the skin on top of the understructure, all what you expect of the pink area around the lip is actually just going to be hidden underneath here. So when you look at it from the front, it gives the illusion of basically a flat lip. So where this is a normal lip, exactly how you've done in your sculpt here, you basically want to convert that into something that's pointing a little bit further down. And then that's going to give you that nice flat effect, which is similar to the 2D concept here. Just looking at some other changes as well that might benefit, just look at the width of the nose. So more specific specifically how close up they are to the eyes. So right now this space is really, there's quite a large gap, where in comparison to the orc here, if I draw them just there and there, it's a little bit more humanoid. It's a bit more of a human facial structure here, whereas right now it's I'd say it's looking a bit more demonic. So you might be going for that effect, but definitely try and track the width of the character there. It's nice to see you've made some changes to the angle of the cheekbones. Some feedback that I originally was going to give, it was your first structure. Obviously these were a bit curved, and also they weren't as large. So in general, when a character's face gets bigger, everything else is going to get bigger as well. So what you originally had was basically, this was like a normal human size, but the entire head had increased and it just looked a little bit off. But the adaptation you've done here is you've made it flow all the way down the length of the face. So now it looks a bit more in proportion to the entire character. So overall, really good. I think if you make those improvements, it's going to increase. Definitely keep a track of the thematics. You don't want to have this area too busy, because it's going to confuse when someone's looking at it. So you've increased the size of the horns there. That's basically drawing attention away from the face. And now because you've got such small features like the eyes, and the nose is sort of getting lost in the mouth as well, when someone looks at this, they might get a little bit hesitant and drawn away. And then in theory, they don't like the look of it. That's sort of like character art director stuff, but it is really important. So to rectify, I would just open up the size of the eyes and maybe have some areas that rest a bit. So once you flatten that lip, that's going to help with that. You know, the top lip's just going to rest. My final suggestion is when you're blocking out the hair for the character. So this is a common effect. Obviously, the one you have here is really good at assessing a silhouette, but that's basically where it falls short. The next section I'd move on to is really split that up into individual components that you can copy over. And then that's going to transition well when you start to do things like hair cards, because you can make the adjustments here and then see what thickness or clumps of hair work, and then interpret that into your 2D hair cards. So I actually go over that process in one of the videos called Adding Equipment. So take a look at that, because one of the characters that I use an example is basically the identical hair that you've done. Scroll ahead to the section that says duplicating fur. So obviously the first stage of the block out is that representation, maybe something like snake hooks, just so you can see the silhouette and how much space that's taking up in the concept. The next phase for you specifically, what I would do is just create a couple of subtools like this, and then what you would do is duplicate them many times and then just position them on the mesh that you've already done. Once they're positioned, it just gives you this more refined silhouette, and then you can start to work with that with the move brush without worrying that you're going to break the original concept. Then when it comes to making the fur itself, you can just take a copy of the thickness of this hair and then interpret that. So I use that process for all characters, but I think it'll be very useful, especially for your one with this sort of like wiry clumped hair. Okay, so the next bit of feedback is for this user who posted in the art feedback section. So feedback for this character, I think the concept's really cool. So there's lots of different elements there that you can work with, you know, hard surface, skin, cloth, and it's quite a simple design. You know, don't have to go into too much detail, yet the character's really strong. The only thing that I'd be aware of is again the decisions on the characters that you use. So with this character, the head's been covered up. Now that can usually be less attractive to people who are looking at art. I'd suggest basically keeping your portfolio shot without the hat, because if we can't see a face, the chances are people aren't going to basically like click and incorporate with that. In terms of the concept, the block out's really good, and it's good to see that you've put the colors in there. I think one element that you could include, which will just bring a little bit more of the theme back, is the stylization of the cloth and the drapery. So while you've done the block out here, it is quite Play-Doh like. So basically come into ZBrush and just try and play around very quickly with trying to interpret some shapes here. So you got some large major shapes. You might as well at the block out phase start to incorporate that. Now if you don't know how to do that, I'll show you very quickly. Quick pants mesh here. So what you've got currently is obviously like softened edges to display the silhouette, but really don't be afraid to come in with something like a clay tubes. And if ever you want to make these sharp sort of angles, what I do is just get clay tubes, do a very harsh selection, and you're adding a lot of clay, and then basically you're just going to push that back with the trim dynamic, and you can be super aggressive with this. And as you're doing that, what's going to happen is these edges are going to form. Now obviously you don't have to refine this, but what you can do is now that you've got that perfect edge, you can just get the move brush and start to move it around, and now you can see you can start to create a couple of edges so that from the front perspective, you can get a bit more of a theme for the character. So maybe, for example, on this concept, you've got a bit of cloth that goes diagonally across the two legs. It's totally okay just to incorporate that very quickly in your sculpt. So maybe something like a clay build-up will be very good for bridging that gap, and then just smooth it away. So, you know, if I was doing this, it'd be totally fine to not refine this. I would just keep it and let my imagination do the rest. But at least you've got more of an accurate silhouette to go by. Just a little bit of work that takes it further, because you've obviously put that already in the hard surface elements. You might as well do it in the cloth as well to bring the character together. So on the same note of that, when you are blocking out the character, I suggest try and put everything that you physically can in. So that would also involve the crossbow, and then with every element that's added, it's going to allow you to have better proportions, more things to reference. So in your case, you might want to include the bow, and you might want to include the quiver at the same time. Just something like a quick box will be fine. So next bit of feedback is for young Tigerian. So I guess this is from a show that I haven't got around to seeing yet. It's probably a good one, so I'm unfamiliar with the actor. I'm just going to go off the reference that you've given here. So overall, I think that the likeness is very good. So from a distance, they do look like a similar character. I think the facial structures are good as well. There's nothing that's really popping out that's telling me that this isn't a human character. Potentially the first thing I see is basically the size of the forehead or the position. It could be floating out a little bit too far. And what that is actually doing is it's causing problems with where you're positioning the hairline. So with her hairline's quite low down on the front of the face. Now, the reason that there's the ability to do that is because her forehead isn't as squared as you've got it represented here. Or potentially, as it can be multiple things, it could be that the back of her head isn't high enough. So just look at the side and really look and say to yourself, is the back high enough, or is the front too far forwards? That usually causes problems with when someone's trying to make a hairline and hair representation from the front. So just look at that area. Nice to see you've put some hair fibers in, and also with some eyelashes. While we're on the subject of the eye, when I look into this character, the folds that are happening off the top of her eye socket here and how it goes into her eyelid, obviously it's very strained and folded, especially on her left eye, where I see that this sort of terminates. We can just mark it there and mark it there. So it seems to me that that fold basically isn't going all the way down onto the inside of her eye. Just be aware of your sculpt, because this fold is basically going from one side of the eye and then it's coming all the way down, and it's actually terminating on the inside, and that basically doesn't match the reference here. So from what I can see, there's just a little gap about this size that you want to open up and get rid of that incision. It's going to fall short. Potentially that may have happened because you were looking at this side of the eye, and from that side it does look like there's sort of like an extreme fold that's going inside to there. Now that can happen. I've seen that on a couple of characters where their left eye is represented like that, but their right eye isn't. So you may want to just change the left eye, and then that will give a nice asymmetric look to it. I think you've done well to interpret the facial shape. She has an unusual mouth structure, and especially with her jaw. So sometimes what people make the mistake is that the person's pouting, so they make their lips very big. I think you've done well to basically approach it from the outside and work inwards. The only bit that is slightly mismatched, I'd say, is basically the corner of the mouth, and you can see it more clearly on your grayscale. And it's basically this fold that's happening just there. That's present on a lot of characters, but for this actor, she doesn't have it. It's totally okay to not include features that are usually seen on someone's face. For you, what I would do is I would just get something like a clay and just fill in that section, and then it should be a bit more accurate to what she has. So if you look really deeply, there's somewhat of an indication here. The problem is it's very, very broad. It's almost like a finger length of divot, where here it looks like it's almost been like scalpeled in. So you could either just try and smooth that greatly, but from what I can see from this angle, is just fill that in with a clay. So the next section I'd be aware of is just the forebrow, and this is probably a remnants from when you were doing the planes of the face. On the brow here, I can basically see the highlight. It's quite a sharp angle, and the same is true with the nose here. So it has a nice effect when you're basically laying out the landmarks of the character, but when you're trying to go for that realism, especially for her, she's got a very smoothed out section. So if I was going to sort of draw a line down here, you can see how it just basically curves naturally. There doesn't seem to be any form of folding that's going on here. So obviously that's going to be very simple. You're just going to get the smooth brush and smooth that out greatly. It's also a similar case with underneath her eyes. So she does have that squinting effect. So it's good that you've got this line that goes outwards. What what probably isn't present is on the inside of the eye. Again, some characters have that and some don't. I think with hers, it's less pronounced. So if I do the same effect and basically draw a curve that goes from the nose all the way to the eye, you can see that's a really smooth transition. And it's almost like a fold doesn't exist there. So what I'm searching for from your sculpt is basically these lines that come out this way and then define basically these parts of the nose where the bottom of the eye socket is. If you look on here, they're very pronounced. And then obviously on the reference, they're almost non-existent. So I'll just smooth those out for a bit more realism. Next area to focus on is basically the neck. It's similar to the brow where you can just see this straight highlight. Usually when it comes to the neck, you've got sort of like this divoted shape. So try and incorporate that. You've got the muscles and the tendons coming here, which is good. It just needs to be smoothed out. And also don't be afraid to increase the size of the wrinkles that are on the neck. I think for her, she's got some quite characterfully pronounced ones, especially near the bottom. Towards the top, they sort of seem to smooth out, but it's worth coming in here and just putting that little notation in. Next bit of feedback is basically around the nose. So it could be the case that you're basically inserting form where there potentially is none. So some people decide to do that just so the face has like a more facey look. But if you're going for one-to-one likeness, if you look at the end of the nose, there's obviously these divots that go inside and it's creating this front shape, this sort of like spherical area of the nose. On the character over here, it seems that those aren't so pronounced. Usually when that's happening, it's more of a structure around the nostril. So while this indentation does exist, you know, sort of the indentation that goes down this way and then separates the front of the nose from the back of the nose, which you have on your 3D sculpt. Sometimes what happens with characters, if I try this to draw this a little bit more accurately, these two shapes basically get bridged with what is seen on the border of the nostril. Basically, the way you can fix this and interpret it is basically a clay build-up, brush in this direction, and it's going to create a tube almost around the nostril like that. Now what that's going to do is basically get rid of the shading and the chasm that's seen in there. Maybe I can blur it a bit. It's going to be very faint. We don't have many pixels to work with here, and obviously the shade's going to be sort of like smudged a bit. If I draw across there, what you can see, it's basically better defining the border of the nostril. So just remember the change that we did there. Now if we look at the concept, you can see where this tube basically goes across and doesn't have a damn standard incision. But overall, really good facial structure here. Now moving on to the clothes, I'd say a little bit more of realism work could be done here just because it's looking a bit perfect. Right now it looks like it's been masked and extracted and not much work has been put into it. So on her cloth, obviously there's a lot of surface variance, and especially when it comes towards the edge, parts of the leather being frayed off. So I'll show you a little trick. If I just turn these pants into a leather panel, just like you had with her tunic, very quick effect you can do is just get something like a dam standard and go on the inside of the underneath the leather and then just get the move brush to give it some variance like that. And then from a distance, it's going to have a nice effect. Obviously, you'll need a little bit more variance from that. And then once you've got the main structure, usually what I do is just go from a distance and get the same dam standard and then just do dots here and there. Now with that dam standard, I'd hold Alt and just try and refine the edge. And you could mix this up with something like a pinch, and it gives a nice bit of variance to that side edge. And then obviously from different angles, it starts to bite and compress in different regions. Another really cool brush for that, you can press comma. And if you come to brushes, I believe under the slash, one that I often use is /1. And it has a similar effect. So you can see here, if you feather it, it starts to have this sort of like jagged leather edge. Now you can go on the inside to really make this nice and harsh and then hold Alt to do the inversion. And then once you smooth it, it gives us this sort of like really ruggedy, flailing look to it. And usually what I like to do is leave the bits of noise that get generated. And then from a distance that feeds quite well into things like Substance Painter and gives us some noisy information. With the surface of the leather, usually what I do is I just get something like a clay or a normal brush and dab it very lightly and then go over it with a smooth. And then if it's looking a little bit too soft, sometimes what I'll do is I'll get the Trim Dynamic or an H polish and then just glaze over it, and then that's going to get rid of the soft look that gets given. And when it comes to the side of the leather, I usually do that in Substance Painter. I know sometimes what people do is they get something like a spray on the standard and then they start to go in like this. You can definitely do that to give a bit more of a visual effect in your sculpt. Like the inside of the leather is obviously not protected, so it's going to start to eat away, or you could just use a different color. But to be honest, I just prefer to do that in Substance Painter. Next bit of feedback is for this character. Didn't come with a reference, so really handy to provide a reference just so I can cross match it, but I can give some advice while you are at this stage. So when it comes to blocking out hard surface, usually what I like to do is shade different layers in different colors. So that involves using poly paint. So with yours obviously is everything, and the only thing that is separating it from the rest of the elements are the shadows that we can see in the layering and any form of like edges that are seen. So if you just get some paint and start to shade the outer layer a little bit lighter in comparison to the darker area. So say for example with the micro mesh you've got here on the chainmail, if that was nice and bright, whereas the underlying surface was nice and dark, that would kind of pop through, then it'd be easier to sculpt on top of. Whenever I am doing 3D concepts for hard surface, so things like armor, and I'll create a quick demonstration here. So when you are doing the bits of armor, I wouldn't suggest leaving it as perfect as it is, because from a distance you can't really see the separation. Usually what I do is just go over with something like a trim and then just break up that edge really quickly so it reads better from a distance, and then you can see the better transition. Now that really comes to an effect where the armor starts to overlap each other. So for example here and here, if we just break up that line, it's going to be easier to see. Now you're going to be replacing it later, so it doesn't matter if it's perfect. If it is a little bit too broad for you, from a distance, usually what I do is I just get the pinch brush and see it from my my concept view, and then just hold pinch and then run along that line. Then that's going to basically concept your edges for you. So once you've got that basic block out from a distance, you can sort of assess and see how big you need to make those bevels so it represents well from a distance. If you imagine you export that, maybe you're redoing it in Maya or Blender, at least you now have a representation of how big the bevels are. Because otherwise, when you're in there sculpting where you're doing your modeling, there's no real reference to how big the bevel should be. So at least now you've got that reference. And also it just looks a lot better for not much cost, basically. Changing the color is as simple as basically selecting a color and then coming up to fill object. And then with each subtool you select, you can obviously change and then click to fill object again. It just gives you that separation so you can start to move these about. So here's the difference between basically like a sharp edge you can see there and the beveled edge that we've done. Next bit of feedbacks for this character. So I think the face is looking good. It's definitely looking realistic. My suggestion is maybe to take the eyebrows off and have those as a separate subtool, because they're going to interfere with the main sculpt, especially if you turn this into character for like a games engine. I like what you've done with the eyes. It's obviously nice to see the iris when you are sculpting, and ZBrush or ZBrush isn't very good at that. The thing that's really poking out is the hair structure. Cool to see that you've used the effect of stretching a strand of hair that can be used multiple times. But if you leave that structure as it is, it can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming in terms of strand noise, especially if you're not twisting and rotating it. So what I suggest for this is basically combine specific areas. You don't have to do it all at once. Maybe put this into segments and then dynamesh those together. And then what you'll do is just get the smooth and blend sections together. Maybe a couple of hair strands are joining into one and then turning into an individual strand. You basically just want to get rid of this, what we call the Mr. Whippy effect. Is basically how ice cream comes out of the tip, and you can see all the edges infinitely down the length of the hair. So just bring back some sculpted elements into this. Something that I sometimes do as well is I'll create a second mesh underneath here. Maybe it's a duplicated version. And then what you can do is just paint on top of that underlayer mesh. And what it's going to do is going to cover any of the parts of the noise that you've got. And that's just a more manageable way while keeping all the different details that you have. And basically, I always stress the importance of making these meshes quite detailed, especially if you're going to turn this into fibers. It's nice to have some direction concepts that you can go off, especially if you're making things like hair cards. Next feedback is for this character, and I think the style and vibe of the character has been represented quite well. I can see that this has been done in Blender. Areas that I basically improve is the attachment of the ear to the main head. So right now the ear is actually coming off a little bit too thin for all its subcomponents. You might just want to thicken this up. The angle of the face is good, and I think the nose you've represented quite well. Potentially what's happening right here is a lot of the shape of the hair is flying upwards at an extreme angle. So basically the angle that's going here is sort of like this direction, and then the outer's up there and it loops downwards. It feels like it's being pulled up quite a lot, whereas in the concept it's got more of a momentum that's going sideways, sort of like in this direction, and then eventually coming down, and then gravity's taking hold. So basically just change the if I can say the momentum of the hair, so it's basically interacting with gravity a little bit better, because it's quite flicked up here. That could be a restriction with the curve tool that you're using in, so maybe get something like a move just to move that down. Another area for improvement is basically the silhouette of the shoulder, and this is going to be an important silhouette because it's giving off a lot of character, physically someone turning their shoulder to you. So just make sure that the overlaps are happening. Right now it's blending into the breast a bit too well. So you just want to separate this so it's nice. Also, the shape of the breast could be improved. So right now we've got a bit of an over arch like this. Ideally, you kind of want to flatten that out or even have more of a concave structure. Now, the anatomy of what's happening there is this character seems to be missing a little bit of a rib cage. And basically what that rib cage is going to do is allow this structure to fall down a little bit more naturally and then loop under and create quite a sharp incision there. So you can sort of see the shape that's here. You just want to interpret that. And the thing that can't be seen is basically the continuation of the rib cage here. So just increase the size of the torso, and that's going to fix your silhouettes when it comes up the chain. Also, at the same time, you basically want to look at the negative space of the concept. So say, for example, there's a separation in between the neck and where her hair is. And this is going to be important. Right now it's quite small, but definitely in your sculpt is basically missing. So you just want to open up this area to allow the silhouettes to basically read from where they are. That would also involve basically pulling the hair outwards just so it matches this a little bit better. Suggestions from the other sculpt, maybe just sharpen up a couple of these folds. So right now they're looking a bit soft. So just get something like the equivalent of a trim in Blender and just flatten the sections of the cloth. I think it'll be a little bit more accurate to this character. Just be aware as well that you're not losing the form of the arm. So right here, the arm's looking a little bit dainty. So I'll just basically thicken that up, maybe introduce a bit more of a bicep and definitely an elbow structure. If you actually look the underside of where the breast finishes and where the concept ends, the elbow is basically somewhere underneath that. Whereas with your concept, it's sort of happening in line with this. So just a redistribution of the length of the arm. Sometimes the camera can throw things off a bit, so it could be the focal length of the camera. You might want to play around with that. But this character as well, I basically look at the surface of the forehead. So if we look at the shading that's basically happening around this section, you can see there's a lot of gradient change there. That basically indicates that this is quite sort of like rounded over like that. On your concept, when I look at the shading, it seems quite flat. So that would indicate to me that basically the forehead is a little bit too flat in comparison. So try and just reintroduce a bit more curvature to the front of the head, just like you would see with a normal skull. And I think that would be a bit more accurate to what you've got here. So if I hide and show it, you can probably see the differences. You've got a nice sort of like curvature for the front of the forehead, whereas here it's quite flat. So you might want to introduce that.